Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Nobbs-Thiessen, and I'm the Chair of Mennonite Studies and the co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, or CTMS. CTMS, for those of you that have not heard the acronym before, is a research center here at the University of Winnipeg in partnership between the Chair of Mennonite Studies, myself, and the Plett Foundation. We support new investigation into Mennonite history from a global and transnational perspective. And we also host an ongoing series of events that present those findings to engage the broadest possible audience. In that spirit, it is my supreme pleasure to, at long last, welcome you and our participants to the opening day of our conference, MCC at 100, Mennonite Service and the Humanitarian Impulse. This three-day centenary conference covers so much ground in MCC's origins and evolution that it would be difficult to summarize it here. From the Ukraine to the United States, and Canada to Kenya, Haiti, Bolivia, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, and beyond, our more than 36 presenters reflect over the next 3 days on MCC's expanded global role across a century. More on that to follow. This conference also begins on September 30th, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. The Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies acknowledges that here in Winnipeg, we work on the lands that are ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Nishnoo, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and that Winnipeg is also the heartland of the Métis Nation. The National Day of Truth and Reconciliation provides us all, I find, with an opportunity to reflect critically on the trauma inflicted on Indigenous peoples by residential school system in Canada, and to honor survivors, their families, and their communities. Today and beyond, we must also continue to critically assess the historical relationships between Indigenous peoples and Mennonites, implicated as they have been in settler colonialism, education, and missionary work and forms of outreach in Canada and the U.S. and beyond. I welcome you to attend all our sessions today and throughout the next 3 days, but especially encourage you to attend our evening session today, MCC and Indigenous Settler Relations in Turtle Island, which will begin at 7 o'clock Central CDT. Now, I'm joined here today by my colleague and co-director for the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Aileen Friesen, and from MCC, my conference co-organizer, Alain Epp Weaver, as well as Rick Cober Bauman, Executive Director of MCC Canada. Before I turn it over to Rick, who will speak next, I want to put forward just a few general reminders. First, our webinar format means that audience members like yourselves are not visible on screen, though you're very much here. You do have a means of participation. And I think a hallmark of the Mennonite Studies conferences I attended in the past under Roy Lowen was this really robust engagement between academics, practitioners, and the general public. Please feel free to use the chat function at any point to introduce yourself to attendees and panelists. This is visible to all. We also have, of course, a Q&A button, and you can use that to input questions you have for the panelists, which will be discussed in a question period at the end of each session. So just remember to put those questions not in the chat where they might get buried, and in the Q&A section. In the Q&A, you can also request to verbally ask your question, and when called upon by the session chair, you should be able to use your microphone and ask the question. We'll see how well that works. Finally, our first panel is going to start right after this, so just stay on the session. Don't sign out when Alan and Aileen conclude. We'll start it all off with Esther Epp-Tiessen chairing a panel on creating the Mennonite Humanitarian Impulse in the 1920s. All right, I'm going to pass it on to you now, Rick.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the University of Winnipeg, your partnership with us here. And welcome to each of you from Mennonite Central Committee. Warm greetings from the whole of our global ministry of Anabaptist churches. I hope in the next few days you sense MCC's eagerness to embrace more fully the complexities of MCC's story. We're deeply grateful for these scholarly contributions to understanding and telling truthfully more elements of that story. Of course, this conference was originally part of the MCC Centennial in 2020, and what we shall experience is a broad sweep across a century. In this sweep, you will hear stories of MCC entanglements with German National Socialism. I want to acknowledge the pain that some parts, and especially this part, of our story will create as we learn again that our traditional narratives about ourselves and our families and our organizations are often not the whole story. I welcome this deeper and more fulsome telling of these painful parts of the MCC narrative. And finally, as Ben reminded us, September 30th, Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So that our evening session today explores our relationships with Indigenous peoples is a gift and a vital contribution to this 100-year story of MCC. I hope this conversation will also serve as a reminder that there are multiple historic injustices for us to name, and in the naming, may there be healing and restoration. And my gratitude, I want to express it for our excellent planning team, presenting scholars, and to all of you who have chosen to participate in this conference. We are deeply grateful. Thanks to all of you. Thanks be to God. And now I invite Alain Epp Weaver and Aileen Friesen to introduce the conference.
Thank you, Rick. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I'm introducing the first half of the conference, and Alan will take over for the second half. As Ben and Rick have mentioned, fittingly, this evening features an event that explores MCC's and Indigenous settler relations in Turtle Island. Mennonites, Canadian Mennonites, of course, are complicit in Indigenous displacement and other genocidal policies, including residential schools, racially segregated hospitals, and the 60 Scoop. And during this evening's event, we will hear about some of these issues. And through this panel, Indigenous voices will explore the historical context and weigh in on what has or has not been achieved with MCC's commitment to reconciliation. The rest of today and part of tomorrow will investigate the history of MCC's engagement with relief and development work, exploring the beginnings of the organization in the humanitarian crisis that unfolded among Mennonites in the Soviet Union. While many Mennonites with roots in that region, particularly among us in Canada, were saved by MCC's food kitchens and remember this early history with great gratitude, there's still much to explore about the environment that MCC had to navigate and the reasons why it felt compelled to undertake this type of work. Although it started primarily as a relief organization, MCC moved quickly into issues of immigration and development. Its evolution from an organization focused primarily on its own ethno-confessional community to a more expansive understanding of those in need can be traced, in addition to the compromises engendered by having to deal with less than savory characters and states in order to achieve their humanitarian goals. The conference will follow this complicated history and this programmatic shift over the course of a century to provide an important context for understanding the evolution of the values, institutional structure, and engagement of MCC. And now I'll hand it over to Alan.
Yeah, so starting on Friday afternoon, we'll have two back-to-back panels that examine different aspects of MCC's agricultural development efforts, support for and accompaniment of small-scale farmers in maintaining and strengthening agricultural livelihoods have figured prominently in MCC's global community development efforts for almost 80 years. The two panels will explore MCC's agricultural development initiatives from the 1940s through the 1980s in several contexts, from Bolivia, Puerto Rico, Congo, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. Presenters will discuss how MCC workers initiated specific projects while also underscoring that MCC's agricultural development work was not a unidirectional transfer, but involved transnational flows of agricultural knowledge. The papers in these two sessions will consider how MCC workers brought their religious beliefs to bear in their work, how they navigated complex relationships with the state, and how they shaped specific communities and natural environments. On Friday evening, join to hear about MCC's role as an incubator and catalyst for new initiatives. Over the decades, scores of organizations in Canada, the United States, and around the world have germinated within and then later spun off from MCC. Mennonite Disaster Service, the 10,000 Villages Fair Trade Initiative, mental health centers in the United States, Disabled Peoples International. These are some of the numerous groups that have grown out of MCC or for which MCC provided a catalytic spark. If we ended the conference on Friday evening, that would already be a very full, robust conference. But a conference tied to an organization's centennial deserves 3 days. So you'll be sure to want to come back on Saturday for 3 rich panels on MCC as a peace-building organization, MCC's role in Mennonite and broader identity formation, and shifting and contested understandings of service, mission, and partnership in MCC. Presenters will explore the challenges of and tensions within MCC's service and peace-building efforts in multiple contexts, from Indonesia to Guatemala, from Burundi to Syria, and from Zimbabwe to Quebec. Presenters will help us reflect on what it might mean to queer Mennonite peacebuilding, on MCC's promotion of service, mutual aid, fair trade, and simple living, and on ambiguities and complexities in MCC's relationship with Anabaptist churches and agencies. We hope that this brief overview of the conference leaves you as excited as we are for the upcoming days. And so without further ado, I turn things over to Esther Epp-Tiessen, chair of our first panel.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome to all of you to this very first session of our conference, Creating the MCC Humanitarian Impulse in the 1920s. As Alan mentioned, my name is Esther Epp-Tiessen. I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Canada, and I'm very honored to be chairing this first session. My heart is also with all the people who are observing today's Day of Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. There's very special events going on in our community as I speak. It makes sense in a conference on MCC history to start at the beginning of the story. And so this session will focus on MCC's early years, the 1920s, when MCC as this new and fragile coalition was finding its way in responding to a major crisis. We have 4 presenters, and I think we will have 4 fascinating presentations. Just a few words about how the session will unfold. We'll hear from all the presenters, one after the other. Each of them will have about 15 minutes. And we'll hopefully have about 30 minutes at the end for questions and responses. As Ben already indicated, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have a question you'd like to pose to one of the panelists, and please indicate who it is that you would like to have a response from. Do not use the chat for your questions. Use that for what you've already been doing, introducing yourself to the group. So let's get started. Our first presenter in this session is Jonathan Weier. Originally from Winnipeg, John is coming to us from Toronto, Canada, where he is an adjunct professor at George Brown College, teaching in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He is a historian of social movements, political parties, and labor unions, essentially a historian of communities organizing themselves for the common good. His unfinished PhD work is on the international YMCA movement and its humanitarian and military work during the First World War. John's presentation is entitled World War I, the Canadian Humanitarian Impulse and the Founding of MCC. Please go ahead, John.
Hi, thanks so much. And thank you for inviting me here and allowing me to speak at the beginning of the conference. Apologies if I'm a little bit rusty. This is the first conference I've spoken at, I think, in over 2 years. So a little out of practice, I guess. So yeah, my topic has evolved a little bit over time. And what I'm really interested in looking at, or really interested in talking about, is talking about the context in which the YMCA was founded in 1920. And part of this is sort of an evolution, a historical evolution of, the idea of humanitarian aid, the idea of charity, an idea that really takes hold in the mid-20th century, or sorry, the mid-19th century. So interestingly, I am going to actually be talking a little bit less about the MCC and a little bit more about the evolution of organizations that contributed to this climate in which the MCC is founded in 1920. Just a couple of introductory remarks. I really appreciated Rick's introduction and his discussion or his mention of how this is a lot of this is going to be storytelling, people telling stories about the MCC. The bulk of my research has been about the YMCA, another religious organization involved in, at times, humanitarian aid and international charitable work. And one of the things that often happens at YMCA gatherings and YMCA conferences is that people tell their YMCA story, you know, talk about how they were brought into the YMCA, how the YMCA impacted their life. And one of the things I was really struck by reading Esther's book on the history of the Mennonite Central Committee is how much of the book is a book about stories, about people's involvement with the MCC. And I myself have MCC stories. I grew up in Winnipeg as a member of the Mennonite community. We regularly had MCC speakers coming to speak at the congregation I grew up in, Charleswood Mennonite Church. I grew up just across Bishop Grandin Boulevard from MCC Canada headquarters. You know, I remember going with my grandmother to work at the MCC thrift shop on Pembina Highway. But also, you know, more existentially for me in some ways, two sets of my grandparents came as refugees to Canada, supported by the MCC. My father's parents came in the 1920s, you know, brought to Canada by the CMBC, the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization. And my stepfather's family left Europe after the Second World War, supported in migration to Paraguay and then to Winnipeg in the 1950s. So I also have these ties and this connection to the MCC, and I have my own MCC stories. One of the things that I found really interesting when I started doing my PhD research on the YMCA and on the sort of world of international humanitarian aid is that as I was growing up, I had always sort of in my mind seen the MCC as being, you know, kind of a large and important big organization in this world, and it is. But one of the things that I found really interesting was that this world was so much more broad, so much more varied, so much more expansive than I'd ever really understood. And so a lot of my study of the YMCA started in the 19th century. It starts with the founding of the YMCA, but it also starts with this early sort of humanitarian impulse that you start to see on the global stage. And this is something to a certain extent that the Mennonite community, that the MCC comes to relatively late. You know, this is an idea, or these are organizations, or this is a tendency that had been very much percolating by 1920, very, very actively in the world, you know, dating back to the 1850s and the 1860s. And even then by the First World War really becomes a catalyst for this kind of international involvement. You see the growth of numerous organizations that involve themselves essentially in mitigating the worst effects of the totality of this global war. And so this is really by 1920, a very well-established world, this world of humanitarian aid, this world of global voluntary sector organizations involving themselves in various crises. And so there's sort of I don't want to say a legend, but there's sort of a narrative that has arisen around where this came from. And much of this narrative sort of starts in the 1850s. And there are sort of two moments in the 1850s that I'll talk about. And the first is the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And this story has sort of become mythical and legendary in its own right. And the story is that a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant, who's actually a member of the YMCA and an early leader of the YMCA movement in Switzerland, is traveling. He's a member of a Calvinist church in Geneva, very much an evangelical Protestant. And he's traveling in Northern Europe or Northern Italy during the battle for Italian independence, or one of the wars for Italian independence. And in June of 1859, he passes by the site of the Battle of Solferino, which is this big battle between the French and the Piedmontese and the Austro-Hungarians on the other side. And he's horrified. He's horrified seeing the disaster that has befallen. He's horrified seeing thousands of wounded soldiers essentially left on the field of battle to die on their own. And this really becomes the moment that spurs the creation of the Red Cross. The idea initially being, of course, to take care of wounded, to take care of individuals who fight in wars and are essentially cast aside and destroyed by them. But of course, this then becomes a much larger humanitarian impulse, whereby 1920, by the First World War, the International Committee for the Red Cross really becomes the dominant organization when it comes to the provision of international humanitarian aid. There are other moments. There's the creation of the British Sanitary Commission during the Crimean War. And then there's also the creation of the United States Christian Commission and the United States Sanitary Commission during the American Civil War. And essentially what you see is you see the creation of voluntary private humanitarian organizations that begin to involve themselves, especially originally mitigating the worst impacts of war and conflict, but then increasingly getting involved in other kinds of international relief. And so one of the things, of course, that this leads to, this impulse leads to, is the beginning of a succession of conferences or conventions held in Geneva starting in 1864, designed to impose rules on conflict and war that will, of course, help minimize the horror of this kind of totalitarian or total war that appears in the late 19th and early 20th century. But you also start to see the creation of numerous kinds of international relief efforts. So, for example, in the 1880s, there are a number of international efforts to relieve famine in India, famine in China, essentially to start intervening to avert humanitarian disasters. Another important moment is the international outcry against the human rights abuses that are part of the Belgian rule, or the personal rule of the Belgian king in the Belgian Free State, leading essentially to an international humanitarian outcry that results in the imposition of rules governing that colony. And so really what you start to see in the years leading up to the First World War in the 19th century is that there's an increasing emphasis on these kinds of international humanitarian efforts, the creation of humanitarian organizations, whether international or national, all oriented towards mitigating some of the worst impacts of war, but also to intervening in cases of famine, in cases of natural disaster, and then increasingly in cases of egregious human rights abuses. And so by the First World War, there's already this well-established tradition, this well-established history. There are a number of global institutions, international institutions, that have begun taking this work on for themselves. And this, of course, becomes even more the case when war breaks out in Europe in 1914. As there's sort of a realization that the First World War is going to become this global war, that it's going to encompass more and more countries, pull more and more countries into this global war, and that it's going to have these ramifications when it comes to a refugee crisis, right? For example, in the summer of 1914 and the early fall of 1914, there are refugee crises, both on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front, civilians fleeing from the front lines. And so there's an increasing emphasis, an increasing realization that these organizations that have begun cutting their teeth in international relief efforts, in conflict mitigation, will also have a role, and an even greater and more extreme role in the world during the First World War. And so what you see is the International Committee for the Red Cross, for example, taking on more and more work. Not only is this work with displaced populations, this increasingly starts to be work with prisoners of war and internees and other detainees in various belligerent nations. Increasingly, you see a realization that there is a role for this international humanitarian community when it comes to the kinds of refugee crises that come out of the genocides and ethnic cleansing of the later part of the war. So, for example, you start to see organizations, especially forming in Western Europe and North America, that have as their goal to support a certain displaced populations. So, for example, there's the Serbian Relief Committee that's formed in the United States, that's created essentially to provide humanitarian aid to the Serbs who are fleeing from the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Serbia. You see the creation of a number of organizations that eventually come together in Near East relief that have as their goal not only bringing attention to the Armenian genocide, but also sending workers to the Ottoman Empire to try to intervene, but also then to bring news of this genocide to the wider world. And one of the very, very interesting connections there is that there are a number of American Mennonites who become involved as workers for Near East relief, who find their way to the Ottoman Empire and do their best to alleviate the suffering of the Armenians at the hands of the Turkish government. And so the First World War really becomes this moment where we see the creation of these new kinds, or the acceleration of this world of humanitarian relief. One of the other things that you start to see is you start to see a real concentration of this, and this comes either under official forms or unofficial forms. So for example, in the United States, there's the creation of the United War Fund, and essentially this is a large-scale fundraising effort on the part of humanitarian and other charitable sector organizations to raise money to fund the programs that they're running, mostly in Europe, but also in the Middle East and other parts of the world. That are designed to provide humanitarian relief, that are designed to support people imprisoned either as domestic internees or as prisoners of war. And the United War Relief Fund in the United States is a huge success. It brings together a number of both religious and secular aid organizations in a fundraising campaign in 1918 that raises $192 million. And that's in 1918 dollars. That's not adjusted. And so this really is a moment when the MCC is founded, where there's this real momentum, this real energy in this idea, in this move towards the creation and expansion of international humanitarian relief organizations. And of course, we also see this play out in the political and domestic, or the political and international forum, with the creation of the League of Nations and with the creation of a number of bodies under the League of Nations, international bodies, that are designed not only to prevent war and conflict, but also to prevent, or also to start getting involved in coordinating and regulating and overseeing these kinds of international efforts. And so that brings me to a certain extent to the MCC in the last 3 minutes of my talk. And I guess one of the things I've always found really interesting, one of the things I found very, very interesting in doing the research, what little of it I could do without being able to travel to archives into the MCC and its founding, is that most historical works, most papers, most books that talk about the MCC generally start in 1920. When they start with the idea of the MCC and how it was formed by Mennonites in Canada and the United States who wanted to do something to alleviate the suffering of their religious brethren in the new Soviet Union. There's very, very little discussion, or at least what I could find without getting into actual archives. Thanks, Esther. There's very little discussion on the influences that contributed to the founding of the MCC. And the MCC wasn't founded in a vacuum, right? There were numerous organizations working in this space. Obviously some religious organizations, some organizations specifically supporting certain communities, for example, Jewish relief organizations. But there were also large-scale international organizations, international movements like the YMCA, like the International Committee for the Red Cross, that were all already engaging in this work in large-scale operations that clearly, MCC leaders would have been aware of. And so what I would have liked to have done, and what I hope I will get the chance to do, when travel to archives and when that kind of research is possible, is to really look into where the idea, or how the idea of the MCC in 1920 germinated. I suspect that there was some connection with American Mennonites who were working as part of Near East Relief, essentially as witnesses and as relief workers in the Ottoman Empire. But I'm also curious to see if there were other venues that Mennonites were working in, involved in this broader world of humanitarian relief, that then contributed to this impulse and contributed to the idea of creating the Mennonite Central Committee in North America in 1920 to address the suffering and the needs of Mennonite co-religionists in the Soviet Union. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. What a great start. Thank you for bringing that broader context to this whole discussion and creating a picture of what else was going on around the people who helped to birth MCC. Thank you so much. And thanks for sticking to the 15 minutes. Okay, well, let's move on. Our second presenter today is Peter Letkemann. Peter is an organist, historian, and business person living here in Winnipeg, Canada. He was born in the MCC refugee camp in Gronau, Germany in 1950. And he received his PhD in musicology from the University of Toronto in 1985. He has taught organ, music history, and music and worship at a number of Mennonite institutions. And he has written extensively on three main topics: Mennonite hymnody and choral music in Prussia, Russia, and Canada, Mennonite victims of terror and repression in the Soviet Union 1918 to 1956, and Mennonite refugee camps in Germany 1918-1951. Peter's presentation today is entitled Negotiating with the Soviets, Alvin Miller of American Mennonite Relief, 1920 to 1926.
If you put on the PowerPoint now.
Please go ahead, Peter.
Good to go. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference and present a short talk on Alvin J. Miller and his work with American Mennonite Relief in Russia from 1920 to 1926. Tomorrow, October 1st, 2021, marks exactly 100 years since the signing in Moscow of the agreement between the American Mennonite Relief, or AMR, and the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. It was signed by Lev Kamenev, one of the most senior officials of the Central Communist Party, and Alvin J. Miller, who would become the director of all American Mennonite Relief programs in the Soviet Union for the next 5 years until 1926. This historic 19-point Moscow agreement effectively opened the door for Mennonite relief aid to be sent first to Mennonite settlements in Ukraine and later eastward to Mennonite settlements throughout central Russia and Siberia. The man at the center of the negotiation with Bolshevik authorities in Moscow and later in Kharkov, Ukraine, was Alvin Jacob Ajax Miller, a highly educated and remarkably talented individual with many special gifts and skills related to his negotiating and leadership roles in Russia. Alvin was born on the Miller family farm near Grantsville, Maryland, a small Amish Mennonite community about 100 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Alvin's father, Joel J. Miller, was for many years a leading minister and bishop in the Amish Mennonite Church. After teaching in public schools for a number of years, Alvin began his studies at Goshen College, Indiana in 1908 and graduated with a BA in 1911. The following year, he went on to complete his MA at Columbia University in New York City. After another 2 years of teaching, Miller returned to Columbia in the fall of 1914 to complete another year of graduate studies in pedagogy and social psychology. In the fall of 1915, Alvin joined the Faculty of Education at Kent State Normal School, known later as Kent State University. He taught on and off at Kent State for a total of 39 years, finally retiring in 1974 at the age of 90. After the end of the Great War in 1918, Miller, age 36, volunteered with the Mennonite Relief Commission for War Sufferers to provide relief and reconstruction service in devastated areas of France. He and some 50 other American men served under the administration of the American Friends Service Committee, or the Quakers, and the American Red Cross. Recalling this time of service many years later, Miller wrote that among these workers in France, there developed the conviction that they should render this kind of Christian service in the name of the Mennonite Church. Quote, "It was our strong conviction that we owed this to our historical past and also to the future generations of Mennonites." End of quote. The result of this strong conviction was a 3-day conference of 48 Mennonite relief workers in the community of Clermont-en-Argonne, about 250 kilometers east of Paris, from June 20th to 22nd, 1919. Miller later wrote that the Mennonite relief work in Russia truly had its original inception at this conference. At the conference, a committee of 4 men led by Alvin Miller was appointed to confer with Herbert Hoover, head of the American Relief Administration, and Colonel William Haskell of the American Red Cross in their Paris offices about possible fields of service for a separate Mennonite relief organization. Already in August 1919, Miller and 2 colleagues traveled from Paris to the Odessa region of southern Ukraine to investigate the needs and possibilities for Mennonite relief work. They were probably the first American relief workers to enter Russia after the revolution. After returning to Central Europe in October, Miller remained in Germany over the winter. In mid-April 1920, he met in Berlin with members of the Russian Mennonite Studienkommission shortly after their arrival in Germany. Benjamin Unruh, secretary of this commission, wrote that this meeting was very meaningful and later acknowledged Alvin Miller's important contribution in opening the door for relief work in Russia. In June of 1920, Alvin Miller was invited by the American Red Cross to travel to Crimea and organize an American Red Cross unit in Simferopol to deal with the cholera epidemic. This was now his second trip into Russian territory. Less than 3 months later, however, the Simferopol unit was closed in late August as hostile Red Army forces moved into the Crimean Peninsula from the north. Miller returned to Constantinople and then traveled to Western Europe for medical treatment. While Miller was serving in Crimea that summer, 13 Mennonite representatives met in Elkhart, Indiana on July 27, 1920, to establish the Mennonite Central Committee for the purpose of supplying relief aid to their fellow believers in Russia and Ukraine. The MCC executive pictured here was elected at the first official MCC board meeting in early September 1920. On September 2nd, 1920, the first delegation of MCC relief workers, including Ori Miller, Arthur Slagle, and Clayton Kratz, left New York for Constantinople to establish the Mennonite Relief Unit. Soon after their arrival, Ori Miller and Clayton Kratz were permitted to travel to the port of Sevastopol in the Crimea on October 2nd, 1920. From Sevastopol, they made their way some 400 kilometers north to the Molochna settlement to meet with Mennonite leaders and discuss plans for the proposed relief work. Ori Miller returned to Constantinople on October 25th, while Clayton Kratz stayed on in Hauptstadt and was never heard from again. Unfortunately, the tragic story of his martyrdom cannot be told here. Before sailing to Constantinople in September 1920, Ori Miller had written to Alvin Miller and invited him to join the Mennonite Relief Unit there. After completing his medical treatment in Vienna, Alvin Miller accepted the invitation and arrived in Constantinople on January 29, 1921, to join Ori Miller and Arthur Slagle. Ori Miller soon recognized Alvin's unique skills and his gift for getting to officials at the top, and assigned him the task of negotiating with Soviet authorities for official permission to somehow get relief supplies and Mennonite relief workers into Russia. Alvin first met with members of the Soviet mission in Constantinople and with American ARI leaders there who were favorable to Mennonite cooperation. On April 6, 1921, Alvin Miller and Arthur Slagle boarded the Greek-owned English freighter SS Albatross bound for Novorossiysk on the eastern Black Sea coast to continue preparations for potential Mennonite relief work in Ukraine and southern Russia. This was now Miller's third trip into Russian territory, but it soon became apparent that relief aid would have to come in not via the Black Sea, but from the north. For many months in early 1921, Bolshevik authorities denied the existence of any famine in Russia, even though reports and photos published in the West showed otherwise. As conditions worsened, Bolshevik leaders finally allowed the famous Russian writer Maxim Gorky to issue a public appeal for foreign aid on July 13th, 1921. Quote, I ask all honest European and American people for prompt aid to the Russian people, give bread and medicine. On July 25th, Herbert Hoover replied to Gorky's appeal, writing that subject to certain conditions, the American Relief Association was prepared to enter upon this work. One day earlier, on July 24th, 1921, Alvin Miller left Constantinople with plans to enter Russia via Riga, Latvia. Arriving in Paris, he learned that the ARA office that Walter Lyman Brown, the head of the ARA in Europe, was in London and leaving himself within a day or two for negotiations with Soviet officials in Riga. Miller telephoned Brown immediately and arranged an appointment for later that evening in London. Then he was lucky enough to secure a seat on a 6-passenger aircraft bound for London. The meeting in London was important because it acquainted the ARA leadership with the fact that Mennonite representatives had already made contacts with Soviet officials and citizens in southern Russia. Miller departed for Riga on August 20th, the very same day that Walter Brown and Maxim Litvinov signed the so-called Riga Agreement, outlining the proposed famine relief work of the American Relief Administration. 1 week later, on the evening of August 27th, 1921, Miller finally arrived at the Windau train station in Moscow, together with other American ARA personnel. They were given accommodations at the former luxury Savoy Hotel in central Moscow. Prior to his meeting with Soviet officials, Alvin Miller met with C.F. Clausen and Peter Friesen, the two most prominent Mennonite leaders in Russia at the time, to get their insights. Here he also met Mary Briga Reimer, who would later become C.F. Clausen's wife. She was a brilliant and highly educated young woman, fluent in 5 languages, who would serve for many years as Alvin Miller's secretary in his Moscow office. During his 5 years in Moscow, Alvin Miller became a member of the Moscow Mennonite Fellowship and sang in the Mennonite Fellowship Choir, directed here by the well-known conductor Vera Franz Thiessen. On 29th of August, Miller presented a letter of introduction he had received in London, together with a memorandum outlining proposals for relief work to officials in the Soviet Foreign Office in Moscow. 10 days later, on September 9th, 1921, Miller was finally able to meet with Kamenev, chairman of the Moscow Soviet and the head of the Central Commission for Combating Famine. Kamenev was a highly educated Russian Jew, fluent in German, and conversed in German with Miller. Negotiations went on for 3 weeks, and the official agreement, as indicated earlier, was finally signed on October 1st, 1921. Bolshevik officials in Moscow had assured Miller that the agreement would apply with equal force in all parts of Russia, but officials in the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic thought otherwise. Benjamin B. Jans, a prominent leader of Mennonites in Ukraine, came to Moscow in late September, bearing a letter for Miller from the Ukrainian Commission of Foreign Affairs, requesting a meeting in the Ukrainian capital, Kharkov, to discuss potential Mennonite relief work in Ukraine. Miller, accompanied by Benjamin Jans, arrived in Kharkov on October 13th. After consulting with members of the Foreign Office, Miller was invited to meet with Mr. Yermoschenko, the second highest ranking official in the Ukrainian Central Committee. They went over details of the earlier agreement for many hours. And the following day, Miller met with Christian Rakovsky, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of Ukraine. The so-called Kharkov Agreement was signed on October 20th, 1921 by Alvin Miller, Rakovsky, and Yermoschenko. Within a period of less than 2 months, Alvin Miller had achieved the remarkable goal of opening the door to years of relief aid for suffering Mennonites in Ukraine and all of Soviet Russia. Unfortunately, there is not enough time to tell the story of this actual relief work. Here, I can only recommend that you watch the moving video on the famines of Russia, produced by well-known Mennonite filmmaker Otto Claessen. In conclusion, I personally need to offer a heartfelt thank you to Alvin Miller and the rest of and Arthur Slagle and the rest of their team members for providing food, clothing, and medical aid to many of my own family ancestors in Chordice, Ostervik, Fransfeld, Nikolaipol, and other parts of the Soviet Union. If it had not been for this aid, they might have perished, and I might not have been here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter, for that fascinating story about Alvin Miller, someone who I only learned about a few years ago, but who definitely holds a very important role in the early history of MCC. So thank you so much. We'll turn now to our next presenter, Odd van de Staaij. Right, Odd is coming to us from Den Haag or the Hague, Netherlands. Odd is a staff consultant in the Government Ministry of Economic Affairs and Agriculture, but he is also currently finishing a PhD at the Free University of Amsterdam. The topic of his dissertation is the relationship between the Dutch Doopsgezinden and Ukrainian Mennonites, focusing on famine relief and reconstruction projects in Molochna between 1920 and 1938. Odd's presentation today is entitled American and Dutch Food Aid in 1922, Differing Attitudes. Welcome to you, Odd, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to share my presentation. You can see my presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's okay. Now, good evening from Den Haag. It's 7 hours later here than in Winnipeg. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts about possible differences in the attitudes of American and Dutch relief workers in Ukraine in the first years of the existence of the MCC. I have a reputation for giving long lectures, and people in the audience who know me are very curious whether this time I will succeed in restricting myself to 15 minutes. So let's get started immediately. Kijk, to check how now to continue my presentation. Ah, there it is. No, my presentation is stuck. We have the second picture now?
Yes, it's just fine.
Okay, okay, then it's working. In spring 1922, American and Dutch relief workers tried to make a picture of themselves and their Russian companions in Orlov in Molochna. Christian Krebil, one of the American relief workers, had been observing the Dutch and thought he saw important differences in attitudes. He suspected the Dutch of using the famine to get a foothold in the Mennonite colonies they could use for commercial activities. In his opinion, the Americans had a fundamentally different attitude towards relief work than the Dutch. In his diary, he noted that the Dutch seemed to be after business more than to find the hungry, and that the Dutch were planning to do the relief work on a business basis, while the AMR did their work strictly on a charity basis. On what observations was his opinion founded, and was he right? In the next 15 minutes, I will try to answer this question. My argument will be along 5 chronological perspectives. First, the contract that was the foundation for the American and Dutch relief activities. Second, the famine relief. Third, the first reconstruction activities in autumn 1922. Fourth, the refugee question in winter. And finally, the role of concessions in the reconstruction. I will end with an assessment of Krebil's observations. As Peter has described in the previous presentation, after the visit of the Studienkommission from South Ukraine The MCC was formed in summer 1920. Shortly after that, in September 1920, a small group of young Mennonites went to Soviet Russia to offer help. But 2 months later, the Bolsheviks conquered and closed the Crimea. The young Mennonites could do no more than help refugees in Constantinople. A comparable development took place in the Netherlands. The visit of the Studienkommission led to the foundation of the Steuncommissie, the Support Committee, in autumn 1920, and the Algemene Commissie voor Buitenlandse Noden, translated as General Committee for Foreign Needs, in February 1921. Because the length of the name and to avoid confusion, I will translate this as the Dutch Mennonite Relief. The intention of the Dutch was to collect clothes and money for the activities of the American Relief in South Russia. In summer 1922, it became clear a horrible famine was spreading over Soviet Russia, as Peter has told, including the Mennonite colonies in Ukraine. The urgency for immediate relief grew. The Dutch were convinced that the Bolsheviks would keep the region closed for the Americans. They decided to find their own way into the colonies and sent a representative, Jacob Koekebakker, to Moscow to get permission from the Bolsheviks to enter Ukraine. After his arrival in Moscow, he joined Miller in his negotiations with the Bolsheviks. Although the Bolsheviks tried to use the differences between Miller and Koekebakker to increase their control over the relief, they did not succeed. Miller concluded one agreement for both the American and the Dutch relief organization. Because Ukraine at the time was independent from Russia, Miller had to go to Kharkov to make the same agreement with Ukrainian Bolsheviks. As Peter has told, on October 20th, he signed a contract with President Rakovsky and Vice President Yermoshenko. The Americans and Dutch were free to organize the relief as they pleased, with or without local organizations. And the Ukrainian Bolshevik leaders were very helpful. Shortly after, Benjamin Jans, introduced by Peter, chairman of the Verband der Bürger Holländische Herkunft, the organization of the Ukrainian Mennonites, sent a letter to the secretary of the Dutch Mennonite Relief, Frederik Fleischer, requesting help in the form of seeds, tractors, and investors in agricultural concessions. In his letter, he expressed his wishes for reconstruction support. As you can see on the left document, it's the contract, and on the right is the letter to Fleischer, in which he says, Ich möchte aber auch gern über die Grenzen der Mennonitenländereien unsere jungen Männer mit Motorpflügen arbeiten sehen. Wenn zum Beispiel eine ausländische Organisation freie Ländereien, Gutsbesitzerland und so weiter von der Regierung gegen einen Pachtpreis in Getreide auszurichten erwirbt. Einen ähnlichen Brief mit der Bitte, technische Hilfe zu organisieren, habe ich auch an das amerikanische Zentralkomitee geschrieben. This letter is important because it shows that Ukrainian Mennonites not only wished charitable famine relief, but also business-like support for the reconstruction of the colonies. I don't know why. Yes. When Koekebakker returned with the news that the contract had been concluded, the Dutch started to compose their own expedition. In December 1921, enough money had been raised to fill 2 ships with clothes, food, and medicine. And on January 16, this picture was made with the members of the expedition. Hein Willink as leader, Jongens as accountant, and his wife would accompany him, and 2 nurses, Maartje Kat and Jans Vermaas. Frederik Fleischer had been given wide authorizations as secretary to take care of the organization in the Netherlands, and characterized himself as the relief dictator of the Dutch Doopsgezinde. Willink arrived in Molotchna in January and made all the necessary arrangements to receive the ships and to get the relief goods into the colonies. Jongens and the nurses arrived a few weeks later. At the end of March, the first ship with food arrived in Sevastopol. Willink had arranged 2 young Mennonites to protect the precious cargo in the storehouses he had rented. At this time, the EMR food kitchens had been operational for 2 weeks in Ukraine. On April the 7th, second day of Easter, the Dutch shiploads arrived by train in Lichtenau on 40 wagons. The Dutch distribution started a few days later. Soon it appeared that some Mennonites in Molotchna tried to get food from both the Americans and the Dutch, and coordination of both relief actions was necessary. So on May the 5th, Americans and Dutch met in Orlov. Miller and Willink had met twice before, once when Miller was staying in Holland to present the contract in November, and once in March, when both were waiting for the goods to arrive. There had not been much communication because both Miller and Willink had been on the road constantly. Schlegel and Jongens could get along very well, and Krebel's function was not clear at the moment. There was a lot of confusion because Miller and the Americans worked as an independent organization with local Mennonites and not as an extension of the Verband der Bürgerholländischer Herkunft. Willink and Jongens, on the other hand, worked more closely with Jans and distributed the food packages through representatives of the Verband. Miller and Willink more or less decided that the AMR would focus on feeding children until 15 years of age and elderly over 60 years. The Dutch would feed adults and families in Malochna which had less than 15 pounds of flour or a cow which produced less than 3/4 of a liter of milk daily. Though they did not make a formal agreement, this turned out to be the division of the work between the two relief teams for the next months. Where the Americans mainly operated through kitchens, as Peter has shown, the Dutch exclusively distributed food through packages. Each community had two representatives, usually teachers, and they decided how much food was needed. They went to Lichtenau to fetch the packages. On the left you see a list of distributed green beans, right a list with the signatures of the representatives for the received amounts of food. At the height of the famine in July 1922, the AMR fed 25,000 persons, the Dutch relieved 21,000. Since time does not permit extensive discussion about the efficiency of the help, I restrict myself to the remark that American aid seems to have been much less efficient than the Dutch when we look at the Russian sources. An American ration cost 7 cents, a Dutch only 1.3 cents. Even though there are differences because of the higher prices of American corn and wheat in comparison to the food bought on the Balkan by the Dutch, and the higher shipping costs for the Americans, this difference appears too big to be probable. According to Schlegel, an American ration cost 1.5 cents. To my opinion, this would deserve more attention, especially now Dutch data are available and Russian historians produce more data from Russian sources. As we've seen, Jans requested not only food, but also seeds, tractors, and reconstruction investments. In August 1922, Willink concluded a contract with the Ukrainian Trade Mission in Berlin. The Dutch would deliver seed grains worth 50,000 Dutch guilders before October 1st. But this action failed because of miscommunication. The most important was that the Bolsheviks wanted the Dutch to deposit the 50,000 guilders so they could buy seed from it. But this was not the intention of Fleischer and Willink, who did not have this amount of money in cash at the time. They expected to obtain the seed on credit and to have the money in cash when it was delivered. The Bolsheviks remained adamant and no seed was delivered. However, this turned out to be not a problem because the Mennonites were able to buy it on Russian markets. Another request from Jans concerned tractors. In December 1921, Fleischer and Willink had tried to find tractors in Europe, especially Germany, but hardly found any. In Europe, tractors were hardly used because the plots of farmland were too small. Fleischer asked Jacob Ewart, the editor of Voorwärts, to publish a call to the American Mennonites to obtain tractors for the co-religionists in Ukraine. They heeded the call, and in summer, P.C. Hebert was capable to deliver 40 tractors to Russia. He got a piece of land of 265 desyatinas in Malochna, which was worked with the tractors. Local Russian farmers and Bolsheviks were very enthusiastic about seeing the latest American agricultural technology at work on their fields. The Mennonites could use the tractors on condition they repaid the cost in 3 years. So this was not a charitable action, but one on business terms. The Dutch managed to buy one tractor in Germany, which was delivered in spring 1923. On May the 1st, Frank Stoltzfus in Constantinople closed the Mennonite relief unit. Some refugees remained, waiting for the boat to Northern America. One of them, Heinrich Schröder, took the responsibility of coordinating contacts with the outside world. In spring, some 250 Mennonites had set course from Kamiah to Batumi, one of the ports still open to international traffic. They hoped to get visa and tickets for America, but the Americans in Constantinople saw no need. In summer 1922, the situation had improved in South Russia because of the famine relief, so they could return home. The emigrants nevertheless kept trying, and the situation became worse and worse. Many died of typhus, and the others tried to survive in small living quarters. Some made it to Constantinople, and Schröder asked Fleischer for help. But Fleischer took the same line as Stoltzfus and advised the emigrants to go home. In his letter from November 13th, Jans also had suggested the Western co-religionists would invest in agricultural concessions. The Americans did not seem interested, but the Dutch were. Fleischer went looking for investors in Holland, but they wanted credit guarantees, which the Dutch government did not give. Willink proposed a large concession in his first contacts with Yarmoshenko and Rakowski in February 1922 and asked if they would like to give the guarantee. Although they were interested, they said they did not have enough money to satisfy the investors. They also wanted to know if Willink was not an adventurer, but as the food had arrived and distributed in May, the negotiations were reopened. Willink's plan was to get the whole of Molochna, 120,000 Deschatinas, as a concession for the members of the Verband der Bürgerholländischer Herkunft. The Mennonites shortly discussed the plan at a conference in Landskrona on May 29th. Krebe was present, and this confirmed his early impressions about the Dutch commercial plans. Although Willink's reputation with the Bolsheviks was seriously damaged in the miscommunication about the seed agreement, he managed to close a contract for a concession of 1,200 to 70,000 Deschatinas in spring 1923. In autumn of that year, he formed a syndicate that made $75,000 available for the exploitation. In spring 1924, he started working a plot of neglected land. It took 2 years to get the land free of weeds and cultivated. The first years, he did not make profits. In 1926, the Ukrainian authorities and a Dutch accountant investigated the concession and concluded it was properly run and could be profitable in the next years with a few minor improvements. But the members of the syndicate did not want to make further investments for several reasons. There was an economic crisis in the Netherlands, other projects in Soviet Russia had not turned out to be a success, and the political climate in the Soviet Union was polarizing around agricultural policies. So in 1927, Willink decided not to return to the Soviet Union. Now I come to my conclusion. So was Krebe right when he suggested the American aid was charitable and the Dutch aimed primarily at commercial profits? No, there were no fundamental differences in attitudes. The famine relief of both organizations was charitable in the sense that it consisted of gifts. The reconstruction activities like the seed contract and the tractors were both credits. The Mennonites had to pay back the advanced investments. And where it concerns the Batumi immigrants, they were also of the same opinion. Nevertheless, some differences can be noted. The Americans organized a famine relief along the lines of the American Relief Administration, which meant they did not cooperate with local organizations, but decided to hire individual locals. The Dutch followed the line of the Nansen Relief and the Quakers, which meant they had no problems cooperating with local organizations like the Verband der Bürgerholländische Herkunft or the Soviet Ministry of Agriculture. Another difference is that the Americans did not seem interested in structural economic relations with the Russian Mennonites. Fleischer and Willink thought the Bolshevik concession policy might offer a chance of developing long-time and profitable relations with the Mennonites. This would lead not only to profits for a small group of investors, but also to closer relations between the Dutch Doopsgezinde and Ukrainian Mennonites, which had been the main motivation behind the relief from the beginning. And last but not least, the final photo with the protagonists of my paper. You can see Willink and Miller in the middle, Krebe on the left, and Jongens and Schlegel on the right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ad. You also have helped to broaden our perspective very much. Those of us who have some understanding of early MCC history, we know about what the U.S. and Canadian people did, and it's also very good to know how Dutch Mennonites were integrally involved. And who knew that the idea for tractors came from the Dutch? Fascinating. So thank you very much. We will go on to our last presenter in a moment, but again, I would just like to remind everyone that if you have a question for one or more of the panelists, please type it into the Q&A function, and we'll handle those questions after Ken Sensenig's presentation. So please go ahead and send your questions. Okay, our final presenter today in this session is Ken Sensenig, who's joining us from Akron, Pennsylvania in the United States. Ken has served with the Mennonite Central Committee for about 30 years. This includes terms of service in Swaziland and Sudan. He currently works in church relations in the MCC East Coast Regional Office and is active in his local church and other church boards. His spare time is filled with storytelling activities and projects on his little farm near Akron. Ken holds a doctorate in education from Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Ken, and please go ahead.
In 1920, conditions within and beyond the collective Anabaptist churches in Canada and the U.S. presented a medium in which MCC sprang to life very quickly. This rapid formation created patterns where none had previously existed. Some of these patterns remain evident 100 years later. Other patterns embraced in this rapid sequence of events seem archaic to 21st century observers. This presentation examines some of the persistent patterns and some of the discarded patterns. Finally, we strive to identify patterns within patterns using the ethnographic data that we found. This isn't an exhaustive examination of any of these patterns, though. The book Feeding the Hungry provides a primary source to examine MCC in the 1920s. Witness this rapid development. A meeting in July 1920 produced a 3-person assessment team in less than a month. That team was on its way within 6 weeks of the initial meeting. From a staging area in Constantinople, 2 assessment team members visited Mennonite communities in early October. Later that month, the first clothing and supplies arrived. A failed attempt to deliver supplies in Ukraine encouraged the establishment of ministries in Constantinople. 4 months after its initial formation, MCC work was unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic. After significant delays, entrance into Russia-Ukraine finally came in October 1921. By year's end, MCC was providing $15,000 per month for feeding programs. The zenith of this originally planned activity, feeding hungry Mennonites in South Russia, came in July 1922, when MCC provided food through 140 kitchens that fed over 38,000 rations daily. This all developed in a span of 2 years. Several church dynamics surrounding the supporting churches provide the first points of commonality spanning a century. Feeding the Hungry lists 5 Mennonite aid agencies in the U.S. that predated MCC. The primary players represented Old Mennonites, the General Conference Mennonites, and Mennonite Brethren. This coalescing of efforts in 1920 produced both the institution and the name Mennonite Central Committee, an institution and name that endures into the 21st century. Similar developments held in Canada as well. Emerging of interest formed the Canadian Central Committee among Mennonites in Western Canada in 1920. Ontario Mennonites had organized as the Non-Resistant Relief Organization earlier in 1918. Today, the 11 governing boards for the international, provincial, and regional work of MCC remain populated by a variety of Anabaptist groups. Mennonite Brethren in Christ, Mennonite Brethren, and Amish members meet regularly to provide input for board decisions. Not all groups brought equal influence to the decisions made by the organization. Part of this skewing may have been attributable to those assuming the role of gatekeepers. P.C. Hebert of the Mennonite Brethren and Ori Miller of the Old Mennonite Church assembled the first written account of the responses in Russia and Ukraine. Long before David Manning White introduced the idea of gatekeepers in 1950, institutions like MCC gave voice to selected individuals and church groups who shaped the narrative present at the board table. Varied representation continues today. A pair of boards, MCC Canada and MCC U.S., jointly manages the international programs of MCC. Membership on these boards is determined by church bodies, by regional and provincial boards, and by at-large appointments. These varied points of entree have produced boards skewed toward 2 church bodies on each national board. In the US in 2021, 60% of the MCC US board members come from MCUSA and the US Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. In Canada in 2021, 85% of MCC Canada board members come from Mennonite Church Canada and the Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. Provincial and regional boards provide other opportunities for smaller and localized bodies to participate. In the 21st century, Plain Anabaptist groups, Hutterites, Amish, etc., representing a majority of Anabaptists in both the U.S. and Canada, remain underrepresented in nearly every area of MCC activity. Since the beginning, MCC has managed the diverse interest of the church participating in the Central Committee. Some participants viewed inter-Anabaptist work with suspicion. This reticence expressed itself early in MCC's existence. When the initial hunger crisis passed in South Russia, the last feeding kitchen closed in 1923, the hurriedly assembled MCC of 1920 sought a more formal understanding among its members. Feeding the Hungry notes, it was agreed that as soon as the work of Mennonite Central Committee was concluded, a more permanent organization should be formed. Plans developed to reconstitute with mostly the same members and a more formal organization to be named the American Mennonite Relief Commission. But the proposed organization never got off the ground. After one board meeting in 1924, the plan was postponed indefinitely. One primary stumbling block was the hesitation of the old Mennonite church to embrace a more formal agreement, thus linking it more tightly to those unlike themselves. As MCC's century mark approached, some of the social and theological matters discussed among supporting churches generate ecclesial restlessness among groups at the MCC board table. These church dynamics persisted for a century. A second enduring characteristic of MCC stands as a close corollary to the church dynamics just described. This is MCC's overt religious identity. The dedication page of Feeding the Hungry provides a ready testimony of this faith foundation by using the phrase, "in the name of Christ," even though this descriptor was not formally adopted by MCC until many years later. At times, that identity needed to be finessed to fit the context of ministry. This is evident in the 1921 agreement signed between MCC's AMR program and the newly formed governments in Russia and Ukraine. As recorded in Feeding the Hungry, the agreement with the Russian government states that the AMR personnel will engage in no political, commercial, or journalistic activity whatever. The very similar agreement with the Ukrainian government adds two words, that AMR personnel will engage in no political, commercial, journalistic, and the added words, religious propaganda activity whatever. Alvin J. Miller later explains this development in a letter to Board Secretary Levi Mumo. Miller writes about the Ukrainians. They added one point, "We may not engage in religious propaganda. I inquired whether there's any objection to bringing in Bibles. The president's representative willingly agreed to omit Bibles." The phrase, "in the name of Christ," achieved another level of attention in 1941. When MCC worker John Kaufman, distributing clothing in England, wrote to Ori Miller and Ernest Bennett. Kaufman suggested that attaching labels to the clothing that bear a little slogan such as "in the name of Christ," the phrase became an informal descriptor of MCC's work. In 2010, all 12 MCC boards approved the foundational mission and vision statement of MCC. That statement includes this phrase, "shares God's love and compassion for all, in the name of Christ." MCC's overt Christian identity persisted for 100 years. A third enduring practice is MCC's habit of working through partnerships. In MCC's earliest days, a U.S. government agency, American Relief Administration, provided the initial umbrella for work in the Soviet republics. The American Friends Service Committee served an advisory role from the nonprofit sector. Mennonite church leaders in Russia and Ukraine offered assistance as the AMR sought entrance to work sites. The practice continues on 100 years later. The 2020 annual report notes that the global work of MCC is accomplished with 511 partners. The trilogy of relief, development, and peace provides a fourth and final identity marker spanning a century. In the centennial year annual report, MCC in Canada and the U.S. lists its program expenses in three categories: relief for disaster response, development, and peace. A century ago, without the benefit of carefully processed objectives supported by professionally designed documents, MCC displayed this trilogy of ministry. Relief came in the form of food and clothing. Development entered the scene with the arrival of Fords and tractors. Feeding the hungry identifies the supporters of these efforts as those who have a peculiar mission as a people who believe in saving life rather than in destroying it. This paper also considers 3 MCC patterns evident in the 1920s that no longer are apparent in the institution. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. The first pattern, discontinued from a century ago, addresses MCC's awareness of the value of both females and males. In the formation of MCC, generally only men served in leadership roles. Only men served on MCC's first board of directors. The initial assessment team was all men, as were those who followed in the immediate months working with refugees in Constantinople. By spring 1921, the first women arrived to serve with the refugees. While these women served ably, the foreword in Feeding the Hungry fails to note their contributions or that of the many female supporters in newly emerging sewing circles. The final report summarizes the response, noting, men were found among us who were willing and able to do the necessary work at home and abroad. These paternalistic patterns persisted. For decades, the board governance work was tacitly determined to be the domain of men. Only male directors served for the first 50 years of MCC's existence. This changed with the appointment of Betty Epp to the MCC Binational Board in 1970. The board minutes record the event. It was noted that Mrs. Aaron Epp is the first woman to be a member of the Mennonite Central Committee. It took several decades for women to attain the most senior staff positions. MCC Binational was nearly 90 years old when Arlie Clausen was appointed as the first female executive director in 2008. MCC Canada presents similar data. Epp-Tiessen observes that MCC Canada leadership remained a boys' club through the 1960s and 1970s. By 1995, Dale Taylor was appointed as Associate Executive Director of MCC Canada. In 2021, the CEOs of the 11 MCC entities include 5 females and 6 males. A second discontinued pattern addresses how MCC receives funding. Most of MCC's early funding came from church groups or church relief agencies that were precursors of MCC. Of the $680,000 of cash receipts accounted in Feeding the Hungry, only 3.5% is listed as coming from individual donations. This reliance on other organizations for funding was codified at MCC's incorporation in 1937. The policies accompanying the incorporation clearly state the committee does not raise funds of its own direct motivation by direct promotion, but secures its finances primarily by contributions from the supporting Mennonite relief organizations. In 1987, plans developed to assign a staff person to fundraising. A memo describing the role of the new financial resources consultant indicates the role is to make personal contact with business persons and professionals who have done well financially and invite them to support the work of MCC. A bit of an apologetic note accompanies this development. A report to the MCC U.S. Executive Committee offers the assurance the assignment will be low-key and will have a very informal quality to it. As MCC begins its second century, many staff in varied positions have donor relations as part of their job descriptions. MCC's online staff grouping named Donor Relations lists 83 individuals serving in 11 administrative units of MCC. The matter of peacemaking illustrates a third altered pattern. At MCC's origin, Mennonites broadly embraced the idea of shunning violence. Non-resistance was the operative word from the Matthew 5 phrase, resist not evil. The largest supporting denomination, the Old Mennonite Church, present in both Canada and the U.S., held tightly to this cultural and religious marker. Some other supporting groups displayed variation in the expression of this ideal. The experience of World War II and the increased level of Mennonite education opened new vistas for Mennonites. Stutzman describes the change in the Old Mennonite Church. The events of the 1950s and 1960s fractured the tight system of ethics held by the church for centuries. Now the quiet in the land were calling governments and the public to more nearly approximate the example of Christ in daily living. By the 1960s, MCC was leading the way in this tsunami of change that some have characterized as from non-resistance to justice. Active political engagement became normalized in some parts of the church, as demonstrated by the opening of MCC offices in Washington, D.C., Ottawa, and the UN between 1968 and 1991. The rapid evolution of this key tenet of Mennonite identity in the last half of the 20th century was not accepted by all Mennonite supporters. More traditional Anabaptist groups prefer the older, non-resistant understandings. MCC's current 5-year strategic plan offers this strategic direction. Increase peace building as a key witness in all our relief development work and expand our efforts for justice and peace. For some supporters, this is a welcome point of emphasis. For others, it becomes one of the more challenging aspects of MCC's ministries. So what does this all mean? Most of the persistent patterns examined apply to sites receiving MCC services. Commonalities evident across the century include overt religious identity, engaging partnerships, and embracing the trilogy of relief, development, and peace. One might conclude that the institution of MCC holds the reins that shape its responses at points of delivery. MCC decides when programs start and when they stop. MCC determines the match between its value and objectives and available partnerships at any location of service. MCC's position on the delivery side displays a remarkable continuity over the past century. One part of these commonalities across the century relates to the sponsoring church bodies, the dynamic of broad Anabaptist support, with certain groups remaining dominant, and the reticence of some groups applies to MCC's entire century of existence. In contrast, all the discarded patterns relate to the sponsoring bodies and supporters. The Anabaptist churches that support MCC are in a position analogous to owners in a for-profit entity. The owners decide basic direction. For MCC, that direction included significant change. If a time warp brought visitors from 1920, they might not recognize these altered practices: gender inclusion, fundraising, migration from non-resistance to justice. These features illustrate how a changing society, a changing church in Canada and the U.S. dramatically impacted MCC. Surely stability and change characterize MCC's first century. One can safely assume the experience of the second century will be similar.
Thank you, Ken. Much to think about. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of our presenters. Each one of them has done significant research and thinking and analyzing to come to this place. So thank you to each of you. I'll invite John, Peter, Ad, and Ken, all of you, 4 of you, to turn your cameras on at this point, and so we can share in the Q&A together. And I will be fielding some of the questions that have come in through this Q&A function. I hope I don't miss them. Doug Entz, a while ago you sent a note to John Weier. You referred to Mennonites responding to the Armenian genocide. While living in Lebanon, 2013 to 2017, we discovered Ori Miller's first international trip was in 1919 to Lebanon in order to respond to the Armenian genocide. Do you have information on this trip? John, I know that you typed back an answer to Doug. I wonder if you might just reiterate it a little bit for the rest of the group here.
Yeah, sure. I don't have a ton. I do need to get a hold of a recently published biography of Ori Miller, to keep working on this. It is interesting. One of the things that I found fascinating was that in reading some of the sources on the early history of the MCC, there was relatively little on Ori Miller's previous involvement with Near East Relief, which is fascinating because it really is very much working in and operating in the same space physically that he would later operate in, taking refugees through the former Ottoman Empire. So I don't have a ton of specific information. What I'm really interested in doing is further contextualizing this period immediately before the foundation of the MCC. And what I'm especially interested in is I'm very interested in people like Ori Miller. I'm sure there will be other people that I can find who are involved in other Christian relief or Christian organized relief organizations, because this really was such a flourishing moment for those kinds of organizations in the period immediately before the First World War and into the First World War. So what I'm really interested in looking at, and what I had hoped to do, obviously the last 2 summers, which wasn't possible, was to do some traveling for research. But I do think that if we start digging a little bit more, we'll find a lot more information on Mennonites who are involved in other international humanitarian organizations in this early period before the founding of the MCC, and how that then contributes to the MCC in its beginnings. One of the things that I always found really interesting when I studied the YMCA is you would see a lot of YMCA leaders who would go on into forming other organizations and taking leadership roles into other organizations. And I suspect that there are a number of Mennonites who were involved in the early years of the MCC who also have a past in other similar types of organizations.
Thanks, John. We have a comment here from Peter Rempel. This is for Odd. Odd, thank you very much for casting light on the relief work of the Dutch. An effort we North Americans have overlooked. So that's just a comment and an affirmation. And then we have another question for you, Odd. This also comes from Doug Entz. Odd, your conclusions on the differences of American and Dutch relief are consistent with our experience in working with European Mennonites as MCC reps in West Europe. Indeed, at the closing meeting of the IMO, after 50 years of cooperative efforts between the Dutch and German and Swiss Mennonites, comments on the influence of American MCC worker Peter Dick were mixed, in that his approach tended to be indicative of an individualistic, non-cooperative American style attitude, which often ignored local on-the-ground organizations or European cultural perspectives. Thanks for expanding our understanding of the origins of MCC. We owe much to the Doeksgezinde charitable endeavors. It's not really a question there, Odd, but I wonder if you might wish to comment somewhat on that, on Doug's comment.
Yes, I think at least from my research, it's difficult to generalize on American or European attitudes, because I think that the American attitude, at least in help in Russia and Ukraine, was formed by the relationship by the American Relief Administration. And Hoover was a firm anti-Bolshevik, and he tried to get as much as space of action and want to keep the Bolsheviks at a distance. So I think the help of AMR was formed by the contracts with the ARI, just like Peter said, the Riga contract. And the Dutch were not constricted by this contract, because they had agreed, they made their own agreement with the Bolsheviks. And they did this from a Nansen point of view. And that meant that they were free to make relations with the Bolsheviks. So I think Dutch were more at liberty to make local contacts and cooperate with the Verein, as AMR was, because of the relations with the American Relief Administration. So I think this explains the difference in attitude, or more or less, in 1922. So I cannot generalize this on cultural attitudes, for instance, from the Americans. That Americans are more individualistic and less interested in local situations. So I think the ARA is responsible for this, and not so much American attitude.
Thank you, Odd. Ken, this one is for you from Fred Martin. Ken wondered what the originators of MCC would think about the focus on justice issues and inclusion in 2021. I'm curious for reflections on branding for MCC and other Mennonite organizations that initially focused on work in the name of Christ. Institutions founded by Mennonites now require broader engagement, which mitigates against a narrow Mennonite/Christian brand. Does broader branding, that is, and he mentions here Abundance, which is formerly Mennonite Foundation, or Kindred, which is a credit union, shift the original vision or expand it? Will MCC need to rebrand? Care to comment on that, Ken?
I would say, first of all, that it's a little bit, we can't transplant people across a century. So if people were visiting from the 1920s and hadn't experienced what those of us who lived in the 20th century had experienced, we can't know what they would say. It's just, I was making the point that some of these things have altered since a century ago. And I think this is a very, very good question. Many of us in the nonprofit world would know of some similar organizations that have rebranded and perhaps have not been as forthrightly religious or sectarian as they were at one point. And that will be a question ultimately for MCC. It will be the board representing, and I use the term owners, which is sort of a corporate term, would need to decide that. At what point does rebranding, or does following the examples of some of these other organizations benefit the greater ministry, and at what point must you retain what has been valuable in the past to keep the support that is foundational to the work of the institution? It's a very good question, Fred. I don't have a very good answer, but it is something I think that does need to be considered, and I'm glad you raised the question.
All right, Peter Letkemann, this one is for you. It's from Aileen Friesen. She is asking, what were relations like between Alvin Miller and the local Mennonite leaders like B.B. Jans and P.J. Froese? Did they have different interests, perhaps especially surrounding the issue of opening a path for immigration? Care to comment on that?
As far as I can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. As far as I know, Miller was not really involved with the immigration. That was other people. His focus was on relief work, first of all in Ukraine, and then after the Ukraine famine was over, he traveled to Siberia and got famine relief going to to central Russia and then further east into Siberia. And he really didn't have much to do with immigration at all. The immigration was the work of other people, C.F. Clausen, Peter Friesen, and in Benjamin Jans, and J.C. Clausen, and other leaders in Khortytsa and Molochna and Moscow. Sorry. So he didn't really have much to do with immigration, and he worked with all these leaders all across Ukraine and up to Siberia, and he didn't speak any Russian, so he would communicate with them in German, and when he had to deal with the Russian authorities, Ukrainian authorities, he would have to have someone there to translate for him. In Moscow, he would have C.F. Clausen mostly, and then or C.F. Clausen's future wife, Mary Briga. She was fluent in 5 languages, so she could translate from Russian, Ukrainian, English, French, and German, plus a couple of other languages that she could read. So he was busy with his relief work, not with immigration.
Peter, I'm going to chime in here and ask my own question. Was there ever tension between Alvin Miller and the MCC leaders back in the U.S. And Canada. I'm aware that some Canadian constituents were unhappy with the fact that MCC was providing aid to people who were not Mennonites. And Alvin Miller felt very strongly that MCC had to be doing that. But there was some tension there. Can you comment on that at all? Did you uncover any letters or communications that would have reflected that?
I wasn't looking at the Canadian. Well, Canada wasn't even part of MCC. MCC was an American organization. Canada had, the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, separate organizations. They weren't part of MCC. And I was looking at just what the work was being done in Russia and Ukraine. And this Moscow agreement that Alvin Miller signed with Kamenev, it stated quite clearly that they were to provide food and medical aid to all people. And, they were focusing on the Mennonite colonies, but there were other people, Ukrainians, all kinds of, dozens of different ethnic groups living within the context of the Mennonite colonies, Ukrainians especially, some Russians, Greeks, Tatars, Gypsies. And the Moscow Agreement stated quite clearly that this aid is not only just for Mennonites. And, so he kept to the agreement, and all his co-workers kept to the agreement that the aid was, going primarily to Mennonites, but not only to Mennonites. There are dozens of photographs that I have from the archives here showing Mennonite relief workers, the American Mennonite relief workers providing food and clothing to other ethnic groups in the region. And the same thing happened later on in central Russia and in Siberia. They would provide food and relief supplies to dozens of different ethnic groups.
Okay, there's a few other questions that have come here about Alvin Miller. This one from Randy Clausen. Peter, thanks for the informative presentation on Alvin Miller. My impression is that after he left the Moscow work in the 1920s, he went back to his academic career and faded from the Mennonite scene, quotation marks. Is that a fair assessment? What do we know about the impact of the Moscow experience on Miller himself? And then I'll just read all three of these, and you may want to comment on them together. Ronald Matthews says, thanks for the presentations. A question for Peter. Given the leading role of Alvin Miller in the 1920s, why did he seem to disappear from the MCC institution? What did he do after his early work in relief? And then finally, Harold Thiessen suggests that Alvin Miller does not have an entry in Gamio. Perhaps you would like to contribute one. So that's just that last one is a comment, but can you speak about what Alvin Miller did after he finished the MCC work in 1926?
Yeah, so he stayed in Europe. He came back to the States in 1927, and for the next 3 years, he worked with different Mennonite agencies trying to provide what are called second mortgage lien bonds, trying to raise money from people in the States to help Mennonite immigrants to Canada buy farms and mortgage their farms. So he spent 3 years working with working with, especially with Maxwell Kratz, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia. And Kratz was associated with several mortgage companies trying to provide funds for these immigrants to Canada, especially to buy farms so that they could live. And then I think after 1930 thereabouts, I think these whole 10 years plus the 5 years he spent in Europe before that, I think they had an impact on him. He needed to take a break. And so for several years, he wasn't teaching. He went back to the family farm or other places, to Goshen, to other places in the States. He was just taking time off. I mean, he was already by then over 40 years old. he wasn't a young man anymore, and he had his agreements, and he came back to Kent State University in 1936. He taught there until World War II, and then during World War II, he was involved with conscientious objectors and some other projects. And then after World War II, he came back to Kent State, and then he was there during that Kent State massacre in 1970, whatever that was. And he was teaching on and off courses in pedagogy, social psychology, which I don't know what it is. But he was very well respected and highly thought of teacher. He taught at other institutions as well in between, but then he retired in 1974 at the age of 90. And but he did fall off the Mennonite radar after 1930. And I don't know whether it was him or Mennonite Church. It's hard to say. I haven't. There are lots of letters, correspondence at Kent State University archives, at Goshen archives, but nothing that I was able to see clearly, which would explain why he fell off the Mennonite radar, whether it was him or the Mennonites. He did resurface in 1962. Mennonite Life in Kansas published a very, very long and detailed article by him. He reviewed his own work with MCC in the 1920s, but then again, nothing. There's no mention of him anywhere in Mennonite press. When he died in 1981, I mean, he was 96 years old. I remember seeing a brief note in Der Bote, and nothing ever since. And Gameo, I've already written a Gameo article, which I will be submitting to Gameo in the next couple of weeks, because there is nothing in Gameo. The official history of MCC by John Unruh in the 1950s hardly mentions him at all. And the same with anything written after the 1950s. There's hardly any mention of Alvin Miller, because he just fell off the Mennonite radar. Yes.
Thank you. There's a comment here from Peter Rempel from a little bit ago. Peter, sorry I missed this when you sent it in earlier. You comment, Canadian Mennonites who formed the Canadian MCC were frustrated by the restrictions imposed by the American Relief Administration on the AMR delivery of aid Mennonites in the USSR, and initially channeling their aid through Save the Children UK. This is for a comment Peter Rempel made. Peter Rempel, I don't know if you have a comment or what that was in relation to. Perhaps you could unmute and say a little bit more about, or if you have a particular question there. Okay, Peter Rempel is not responding, so maybe he's not.
I mentioned earlier that there was some tension between Hoover and his anti-Bolshevik opinions with working with it, trying to stay far away from the Bolsheviks. And Miller was a little bit more cooperative. In fact, I didn't mention this, but in his history of this whole period, Benjamin Unruh has written that Alvin Miller seemed to be too friendly to the Bolsheviks. he seemed to give them the benefit of the doubt. Of course, Benjamin Unruh and most Russian Mennonites, they had nothing, no love lost between them and the Bolsheviks. But Alvin Miller seemed to be able to cooperate, and that's, I think, why he was able to work so successfully with the communist authorities in Moscow and in Kharkov, and later on in Siberia. He was more cooperative in working with these Bolsheviks than the other people were.
I have a question for you, John. you kind of intimated in your presentation that MCC or the Mennonites were slow to get involved in this movement for humanitarian assistance, which was happening around the world. And you said, well, you'd like to get into the archives to do some more research on why that could be the case. Do you have any theories that you might want to throw out today?
Yeah, it's interesting, Esther. A thought too came to me listening to Peter's presentation, and especially his more recent answers. And one of the things I found really fascinating is, of course, I came to the study or am beginning the study of the YMCA, or sorry, of the MCC, coming from a study of the YMCA and other Christian, charitable sector organizations. And there's some really interesting sort of peculiarities to the MCC, and I think in some ways these are also peculiarities to the Mennonite community that maybe are sort of kept it apart, I guess, a little bit from these broader movements. One of the things I found fascinating when I started actually studying the MCC is that, unlike so many of these other aid organizations and this growing sort of international community of often Christian-inspired humanitarian and development organizations, the initial MCC focus on doing work with Mennonites especially, to me was really fascinating, because in this period, most of these organizations that are working in this space are expanding outside of the Christian population, especially in the Christian community, especially in this work. So, for example, the YMCA during the First World War grows exponentially, serving soldiers' needs, refugee needs, the needs of prisoners of war and internees, and it's on the explicit understanding that they'll serve whoever, no matter what their religious background. So, for example, the YMCA found itself providing humanitarian, medical, religious, and recreational services for soldiers in the Middle East who were part of the Allied armies. And these would be provided for soldiers whether they were Christian, Jewish, Muslim. And so it's very interesting, because what I found fascinating was, in this period, there's such a focus within the Mennonite community and the MCC on relief for Mennonite brethren. There was obviously an expectation that this relief would be provided to others in the Ukraine during the same period. But I found that really fascinating. And I think that there's a part of me that wonders if maybe the lateness of the arrival of the Mennonite community to this place and to this space has something to do with, the introspection and the apartness of the Mennonite community, the apartness, not being a part of these larger Christian trends. One of the things that came up in a discussion I was having as a little part of this sidebar is that a lot of this humanitarian involvement and this expression of maybe a Christian ethos without necessarily Christian missionary work comes out of the Third Great Awakening in the United States during this period, and really sort of sees itself as being an outshoot of the call to mission work that you find from people like Dwight Moody, that then gets also translated into international humanitarian work. And I wonder if the fact that sort of Mennonite religiosity maybe wasn't involved in that same sort of awakening and broader Christian movement also resulted in less of an involvement in these other movements that were offshoots of that moment in especially in North American mainstream Protestantism.
Esther, Ken Sensenig here. May I make a comment to some of my colleagues here?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Thank you, my co-presenters. I learned a lot. I appreciate it much. Just the discussion about Alvin Miller. He never married and never had children, but he saved kind of all the documents, it seems, from his lifetime. And there's a vast repository of Alvin Miller boxes of materials at the Castleman Historians in Grantsville, Maryland. Peter, you may be familiar with that. There will be a project, if somebody is looking for a small or even a very large dissertation research project. There's a tremendous amount of material that the very small Castleman Historian Society in Grantsville, Maryland has been processing, because that's Peter's, that's Alvin Miller's hometown. The cemetery plot, the gravestone we saw is at the Maple Glen Church, just right in Grantsville, which is, I think, a conservative conference Mennonite church.
Thanks, Ken. I have a question here from Alain Epp Weaver. And this is for you, John. In its early decades, MCC leaders often talked about prioritizing aid to the household of faith, citing Galatians 6, verse 10. This was arguably in tension with broader humanitarian principles of providing assistance based solely on need without regard to religion. Do you see similar tensions in the YMCA or other Christian humanitarian organizations in the decades after World War I?
No, I don't actually. And this is another really sort of fascinating difference I find between the MCC and this broader community of international humanitarian organizations. Partly as a result of First World War work and work in that moment, there's an increasing process of secularization that you see in a lot of these originally more religiously motivated humanitarian organizations. So the International Committee for the Red Cross by this point has become very much disassociated from Denon's original sort of evangelical call to action. The YMCA, which is my focus, increasingly, partly because of its First World War work, which sees it working with much broader communities, not just within the Christian community, but outside the Christian community, you really start to see even a disconnect between the sort of Christian imperative of this humanitarian work and a more sort of humanist idea of why this work is necessary. And so, this work for the YMCA, for example, at the beginning of the World War, of the First World War, is very much still associated with sort of a proselytizing mission, right? It's about reaching all of these young men, these soldiers who are in need of Christian support as they're away from their families involved in this difficult work. And increasingly by the end of the war, and then especially by the Second World War, a lot of this work, whether it's sort of more broad humanitarian work or religious recreational work with soldiers, is increasingly sort of divorced from a Christian mission. So by this point, a lot of those organizations have become to see themselves as more humanist internationalists. And while they often speak in a sort of Christian vernacular, in a Christian language, it becomes a more universalist, humanist idea of international relief in this other kind of work.
Here's a bit of a follow-up question by Lorna Pauls. This might be for you, John. It's not indicated who this is for, but Ken, you may also wish to respond. Might the MCC reticence to reach out to other communities be related to the in the world and not of the world interpretation of scripture? Do either of you want to respond to that comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, I do think that's part of it. It's such an interesting thing about MCC, and it's such an interesting thing about the Mennonite community more broadly, right? And I do think that is a part of the issue. And I think part of it too is that a lot of these organizations, the ones that I've studied before coming to the MCC, they also started this as part of a missionary imperative as well. A lot of, for example, a lot of the early YMCA work was very much about reaching people who would then be more susceptible and open to a Christian message, to Christian conversion, or to a strengthening of Christianity in the face of sort of the secularizing forces of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And so there was always, I think, much more of an expansive view of the goal of this work that I do think you're right, Lorna, is in conflict with or contradiction or opposition to sort of the apartness that you see in that interpretation of scripture and that interpretation of the place of the Mennonite community in the world. Yeah, very much so.
Ken, anything from you on that?
Yeah, Lorna, I think you have a very interesting point there. I made reference to some of the reticence of the old Mennonite church when the Reformation or reforming of MCC was on the table in 1924. And it was the old Mennonite church that didn't see its way forward in embracing too tightly even fellow Mennonites. And so that large denomination spanning the United States and Canada was in 1920 still still finding its way into modernity. The movement from German to English was happening in these churches. The question of distinctive clothing was a big issue in the old Mennonite church. And so the whole business of reaching out to others and hobnobbing with others very unlike oneself was a difficult decision to make. When there were obvious needs, it happened, but we see almost immediately sort of this pulling back again. The loose federation of MCC was enough of cooperation with other groups, even Mennonites, unlike themselves, for the old Mennonite church in the early 1920s.
Can I add something?
Certainly, go right ahead.
Yeah. From this discussion, it reminds me from discussions I had in the beginning of my research with friends who asked, is this a Christian relief action or is this humanitarian? With which they meant, is this only help for co-religionists or is it also for other people in the region? And then I said, at least what I can read from the Dutch sources, it was in the first place intended for Mennonites and not for others. And also in the negotiations with the Bolsheviks, they tried to restrict themselves as much as possible to regions where Mennonites were very simple in the majority. And were also discussions between Miller and Willink at the first month when they were in Ukraine. In what way are we, can we help non-Mennonites? Because they knew that the people who had sent money expected the money to be spent on Mennonites. And the Bolsheviks wanted to have the relief in a humanitarian way. And that was also, there was a tension. That's one thing. And to Jonathan, when it comes to tradition, I think when it comes to Mennonites, there's also this old diaspora tradition. When in the 17th and 18th century from Amsterdam, there was also a kind of central relief committee which helped Mennonites in troubles in, for instance, Prussia or elsewhere or in Switzerland. So I think there's also this longer tradition of Mennonite help in diaspora. And I also tend to see at least MCC work in the first years as a continuation of this tradition, maybe even more than the humanitarian organizations you described rising from the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. If there is one more question or one more comment, any of the panelists, if you have a concluding thought you'd like to share.
Just one quick thought about what Odd was mentioning. I do think he's very right. There is a sort of diaspora tradition that encourages this kind of maybe self-help humanitarianism. You know, and we've seen this in different moments, right? You know, the aid of North American Canadian Mennonites for Mennonites immigrating to the Canadian West in the late 19th century. There's sort of already this tradition of self-help. And I think also a tradition of maybe the creation of Mennonite benevolent community, you know, organizations, you know, organized generally through the church congregation. But there is, I think, a tradition of self-help within the Mennonite community and within the diaspora. And I think that's part of what this early MCC tension between broader humanitarianism and Mennonite-focused humanitarianism can also speak to or be a part of.
Thank you. And I think that's a theme that we will be returning to later in one of the sessions. Yeah. So we're at 3 o'clock. This is our closing time. Thank you so much to John, Peter, Ad, and Ken for your presentations. You have done a great job in getting us started. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who have sent your questions and participated. I also see in the chat here quite a few thank yous coming in. So take that to heart. And there's also a note here from Ben that we will begin, we will stop for now. We'll take a break for 30 minutes, come back together and talk about immigration, and refugee newcomers. So thanks all and see you later.